honestly speaking, I'm not sure what I'm doing here, because this report is the ticket to listen and to hear the report of Steve Fuller, and now after 3 reports I see that my colleagues left me without any topics to discuss. That's why I prepared something.
Very careful, isn't it?
Is it better now? Okay, so I skip the part with interdisciplinarity, and I will talk about puppets, Bilbo Baggins and prototypes. Yes, and my approach is strictly interdisciplinary one, because I just decided not to be that serious as the titles of other reports, and I decided to employ in discussing this issue some metaphors, analogies, and films, books from popular culture. Because popular culture shapes our lives, shapes our understanding of the world. That's why I think that it's good to employ them and to look at, let's say, scientific issues from a little bit different perspective. The title that I've chosen for this report is a quotation from Jim Jarmusch movie, which is called Dead Man. Then I'll be back to it, and I'll try to explain why I have chosen this. So, the major idea of my report is just to try to interpret interdisciplinarity as a kind of travel or journey. Journey there and back again. And I see interdisciplinarity as a kind of journey on 2 levels. One level which was already discussed pretty much, pretty a lot about it. It's mental one, when you cross your, let's say, philosophical field and you move to other field. And the other issue which is really important, I think, and still nobody talked about that, is geographical journey, which means the notion of return. Usually, when we talk about interdisciplinary issues, they are not from Lithuania, they are from abroad, usually from the western part of the world. And usually persons from here, they go there, they get ideas, and they have to return. And looking at the manners of return, again, speaking using notions of popular culture, we can find at least 4 different ways how the return is possible and what character of the return looks like. So the first notion is prodigal son. So it's the person who loses his legacy, who repents and comes back. So in this case, it would look like there are some young scholars going to, let's say, foreign university, then fails to stay there for a longer time, returns here and repents and tries to get back into academia. But it's not the issue that I'm going to talk about. The next manner of return would be that of Rip Van Winkle, where the guy returns after 20 years, and when the guy finds a really different world. And again, it's not the issue with interdisciplinarity things. Then we can talk about the return of the hero. Usually, when we talk about the heroes returning, we have in mind Ulysses or Odysseus, who returns as a king, as a victorious one, and he reintroduces the regime ancien. But again, if to look at deviations from the model of Odysseus, then there are 2 hobbits. 2 hobbits that are returning from journey, and the journey for both of them is really changing their life. If anyone here watched the trailer for the new film by Peter Jackson, Hobbit, which will be on screens next December, so there is one quotation in there. At the end of the trailer, Bilbo Baggins asks Gandalf, "Can you promise I will return?" And Gandalf answers, "No. And if you do, you will not be the same." So in this case, we see some resemblances with interdisciplinary issues, because Gandalf, he wants to show that the returning means different person, returning with different experience. And if you remember the book by Tolkien, you should remember one very interesting issue, because Bill returns as a hero, but after some time he is interesting only to kids and children because of fun stories. Adults and other, let's say, established persons, they do not care about Bilbo's stories because he is too deviant and he is too out of order. And that's why he keeps on telling the stories. He educates children, but when children they grow up, they usually do not care about what they heard, because they attribute it to kind of a story that are not really interesting. Even more interesting story is with Frodo Baggins, because he returns as a hero, but he cannot stay in that community. And after some time he must leave the Shire, and he joins elves and he sails somewhere. And again it resembles a little bit what Steve told about building or self-education. Because if we would look at, let's say, Fellowship of the Ring, we can treat it as an interdisciplinary community. Because there are 4 hobbits, 2 humans, 1 elf, 1 dwarf, and 1 magician. Which means that composition is not that good, because the weakest element is represented by the biggest number of persons, I mean hobbits. And again, it works when they have a mission, it works when they have a project, which means they have to destroy something. But when the mission is accomplished, they split and they have to return to the world, which is the old one. But again, speaking about this kind of issues, I think that Jim Jarmusch, he is closest to describing of what really interdisciplinary is. Let me quote, the quote will be a pretty long one, from the film Dead Man, and it's a story of India, whose name is Nobody. And his story is the following. My name is Nobody, he who talks loud, saying nothing. My blood is mixed. My mother was Om Gafi Fi Gami. My father is Absolute. This mixture of blood was not respected. As a small boy, I was often left to myself, so I spent many months stalking the elk people, to prove I would soon become a good hunter. One day, finally, my elk relatives took pity on me, and a young elk gave his life to me. With only my knife, I took his life. I was preparing to cut the meat when white men came upon me. They were English soldiers. I cut one with my knife, but they hit me on the head with a rifle. All went black. My spirit seemed to leave me. I wasn't taken east in a cage. I was taken to Toronto, then Philadelphia, and then to New York. Eventually, I was taken on a ship across the Great Sea over to England, and I was paraded before them like a captured animal, an exhibit. Also, I mimicked them, imitating their ways, hoping that they might lose interest in this young sage, but their interest only grew. So they placed me into the white man's school. It was there that I discovered a book which changed my life. It doesn't matter because of conflict there, but I made careful plans and eventually escaped. Once again, I crossed the great ocean. I saw many sad things. As I made my way back to the lands of my people, once they realized who I was, the stories of my adventures angered them. They called me a liar, he who talks loud, saying nothing. They ridiculed my own people, and I was left to wander the earth alone. I am alone. And so, if to look at the story closer, we can find 9 stages of the story, and those 9 stages, they perfectly fit into the discussions of interdisciplinary issues. So, if we start with the first thing that is obvious in Nobody's story, he tells about mixed blood which is not respected. If to look at interdisciplinarity, so we can say that this can mean, let's say, a young scholar who has some suspicious academic interests, or he represents a known or not respected academic institution, somewhere in province, somewhere outside the central and powerful places. So the next stage, nobody tells that he is often left to himself, which means that if we get back to interdisciplinary issues, we speak about the guy who is outside academic community, who is not interesting, and who stays all the time alone, reading books and trying to prove what he is about. Then this third stage is hunting activities, where nobody tells that he wants to prove that he is a good hunter. And the same could be applicable to a young scholar, let's say somewhere in a savage land, just like Lithuania sometimes happens. So it means pursuing specific problems in order to prove that he or she would soon become a good researcher. Again, to prove that he has a potential. Then, fourth stage is kidnapping of nobody. And that's a little bit hard to find kind of resemblances between scholars and nobody, but I decided to choose some arguments or some proposals that you cannot refuse. It can be some arguments, really strong arguments, that changes everything, that moves you somewhere, or that can be, let's say, possibility to receive scholarship and to move to study to a foreign university. It's not a story about myself, but I fit myself into the stage number 4 because my trigger was Paul Feyerabend, and when I read his Science in a Free Society, that changed my academic interest, and I decided just to stick with philosophy of science and not with rational theology as before. So again, stage number 5, travel revealing strange world, nobody. And the same could be applicable, applies to the scholar things when he or she sees different strange world, which is not that he used to. Then mimicking, again, mimicking means that you have to learn how to talk, how to research, you have to learn some new jargon, you have to learn some new language, methods, etc., etc. Then escape and return. Probably one of the motives that moves people to return back, let's say, to eastern part of Europe, it can be homesick, but I think that the more radical one is when people return because they cannot establish themselves in that academic system, because they can get tenured, they can get full position, and that's why they decide to return. That's where Aldis and nobody had the same experience. Then, stage number 8, it was said that he was ridiculed by his own people. So this could be again explained by misunderstanding by, let's say, community which was left, or other community at the country, and it's the same emotional issues. And stage number 9, becoming nobody. He who talks loud, saying no. So again, it could be applied to that, let's say, context. We can easily imagine the guy who returns with, let's say, really interesting theories, really interesting issues, but nobody cares about what he's doing. Usually, when you are, let's say, from the field of philosophy, you can hear that Jacques from Paris, or let's say, other guy from other town, spoil your mind, and that's why you are just talking fashionable nonsense, fashionable bullshit. That's why we are not going to listen to you. Just be silent or stay alone. And so, what I wanted to say that interdisciplinarity, it means being at least between two possible kind of communities, two possible disciplines. And if to define interdisciplinarity, I do not want to get into that really serious issues about what's going on in there. So I have chosen John Moran's definition, which was the shortest one. And John Moran claims that interdisciplinarity means any form of dialogue or interaction between two or more disciplines.